The story begins not with marble or gold leaf, but with discipline. Long before a mansion rose on 42 acres of land, long before elephants wandered manicured lawns and music thundered from cathedral-sized rooms, there was a man who believed order was the highest virtue. Asa Griggs Candler Sr. was not born into spectacle. He was born into structure. Raised in rural Georgia, shaped by Methodist faith and the rigid moral codes of the 19th century South, he believed success was something earned through restraint, repetition, and control. Emotion was a weakness. Excess was a danger. Discipline, above all, was survival. When he acquired the Coca-Cola formula in the late 19th century, he did not see indulgence. He saw potential. The drink itself was unremarkable. What mattered was consistency, branding, distribution, obedience to a system. Under his leadership, Coca-Cola expanded not because it was exciting, but because it was relentlessly managed. Every bottler followed rules, every advertisement carried the same promise. Every salesman followed a script. The company grew into an empire because Asa Candler Sr. demanded uniformity, not imagination. That same philosophy defined his household. His children were raised in comfort but not softness. Expectations were clear, reputation mattered, behavior mattered. The family name was an asset to be protected. Wealth was not a toy. It was a responsibility. To Asa Sr., legacy was not about enjoyment. It was about endurance. But families are not corporations, and systems that thrive in business often fracture in private. Asa Griggs Candler Jr., the second of 5 children, grew up in the shadow of a father whose presence filled every room, even when he was not there. From an early age, Buddy, as he was called, stood apart. Where his older brother absorbed structure, Buddy resisted it. Where others complied, he drifted. He struggled to sit still, struggled to focus, struggled to conform to expectations that felt suffocating rather than stabilizing. In an era that had no language for attention disorders or emotional divergence, his behavior was read as defiance, irresponsibility, or immaturity. The family's solution was distance. At 8 years old, Buddy was sent away, not to correct his curiosity, but to contain it. His education became fragmented. His sense of belonging followed. While his siblings learned how to function within systems of power, Buddy learned how to escape them. That tension never resolved. It merely evolved. As the Coca-Cola fortune grew, so did the expectations placed on the Candler children. They were heirs not only to wealth, but to an image. Atlanta society watched them closely. Every move was compared to their father's restraint. Every failure felt magnified. Buddy, in particular, struggled to find a role that fit. He worked on company ventures, traveled to establish bottling operations, and involved himself in new technologies like automobiles and aviation. But his energy was inconsistent. When inspired, he worked obsessively. When bored, he disappeared mentally, if not physically. This pattern followed him into adulthood. Marriage brought no stability. The death of his infant son shattered whatever emotional balance he had managed to construct. Grief did not slow him down. It accelerated him. He responded not with withdrawal, but with motion. Projects multiplied. Ideas escalated. Risk became irresistible. Where others mourned quietly, Buddy tried to outrun loss through ambition. This was the psychological soil from which the mansion would eventually grow. In the years leading up to the First World War, Buddy invested in ventures that reflected his obsessions rather than his strengths: automobile racing, experimental agriculture, aviation. His Atlanta Speedway, built at enormous expense, was both visionary and financially disastrous. It collapsed within 2 years, unable to sustain itself. Yet even that failure produced an unintended legacy. The land became Candler Field, the foundation of what would grow into one of the busiest airports in the world. Buddy's life followed this pattern repeatedly. Grand ideas, poor execution, lasting consequences. Then came the inheritance. When Asa Candler Sr. became mayor of Atlanta in 1916, he made a decision that would ripple through the family for generations. To avoid conflicts of interest, he transferred ownership of Coca-Cola to his children early. Each received a fortune large enough to reshape their lives permanently. For Buddy, even a reduced share was transformative. He was no longer a restless son searching for direction. He was independently wealthy in an era when such wealth carried near mythic power. 3 years later, the children sold Coca-Cola outright. The sum was staggering. In modern terms, hundreds of millions of dollars changed hands. The disciplined empire builder watched as the structure he had spent decades constructing passed beyond family control. For his children, the sale represented freedom. For Buddy, it removed the last remaining boundary. It is impossible to understand what came next without understanding that moment. The sale did not simply provide money, it removed accountability. There was no longer a father overseeing decisions, no company structure enforcing limits, no future inheritance to protect. Buddy was wealthy, autonomous, and emotionally unmoored. He turned toward land. On Williams Mill Road, north of Atlanta, he purchased a modest farm. At first, it served practical purposes. Agriculture appealed to his desire to innovate. He installed modern equipment, electrified barns, experimented with efficiency. Experts praised the operation, but farming was only the surface. What mattered was ownership, space, control. As nearby family members built elegant but restrained homes in Druid Hills, Buddy's imagination expanded. He did not want refinement. He wanted scale. He did not want a residence. He wanted proof. Construction on the mansion began in 1920. The design drew from Georgian revival traditions, but the execution ignored restraint. Every room grew larger than necessary. Every feature became an opportunity to outdo someone else, his father, his brother, the city itself. The house rose quickly, consuming money with little resistance. Imported materials, custom craftsmanship, hand-carved wood, marble fireplaces in bedrooms, gold leaf ceilings. This was not a home designed for living. It was designed for demonstration. The estate that became Briarcliff was not meant to be private. It was meant to be seen. The terraces, the gardens, the pools, the views, all were stages. And Buddy was determined to fill them with spectacle. Yet the mansion was only the shell. What made Briarcliff extraordinary was not its size, but what Buddy chose to put inside it. Music came first. Not casually, but overwhelmingly. He built a hall that rose 3 stories high, then filled it with an organ larger than most churches could afford. The instrument was not selected for nuance. It was selected for dominance. It was one of the largest privately owned organs in the region, installed not to accompany worship, but to announce power. Concerts were hosted. Radio broadcasts carried the sound across Atlanta. Guests sat beneath carved ceilings while the music thundered around them, enveloped by wealth turned audible. But sound was not enough. Buddy craved wonder. Illusion followed. Magic equipment filled rooms, disappearing cabinets, trick boxes, secret doors. The third-floor ballroom became a theater of controlled impossibility. The mansion transformed into a place where reality itself seemed flexible, where rules bent under the force of money and obsession. Then came the animals. The private zoo was not a whimsical addition. It was a declaration. Elephants wandered the grounds. Big cats were housed nearby. Exotic birds filled aviaries. This was not conservation, it was possession. The animals existed to astonish, to overwhelm, to reinforce the idea that Briarcliff was not bound by ordinary limits. To outsiders, the estate appeared magical. To those inside, it was something else entirely. Maintaining such a world required labor. Servants lived on site, groundskeepers worked constantly. Performers, musicians, handlers, and guests moved through a space that never truly rested. The mansion demanded attention the way a machine demands fuel. And Buddy, for a time, was happy to feed it. But systems built on impulse are fragile. Behind the spectacle, cracks formed. Financial outflows exceeded returns. Social tolerance thinned. Neighbors complained. Accidents occurred. Lawsuits followed. The zoo, once a symbol of wonder, became a liability. The magic parties, once glamorous, grew strange. And Buddy himself began to withdraw, even as he performed. This chapter of the story is not about collapse yet. It is about construction, about how a fortune inherited without structure became a laboratory for unchecked ambition, about how a man raised under rigid discipline responded not by embracing freedom, but by building a private universe governed only by himself. Briarcliff was not hiding anything in its early years. Everything was on display. The excess was visible, the noise was public. The spectacle was intentional. What Buddy did not yet understand was that a house designed to amplify its owner's desires would eventually amplify his weaknesses as well. The very spaces created to impress would soon contain grief, scandal, and silence. The wonders would not disappear, but their meaning would change. And once that shift began, Nothing inside the mansion would ever be hidden again, whether Buddy wanted it to be or not. By the mid-1920s, Asa Candler Jr. had achieved what he believed was success on his own terms. He no longer lived in his father's shadow financially. His mansion stood larger and louder than those of his siblings. His estate was talked about across Atlanta, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with disbelief. On the surface, Briarcliff appeared to be the ultimate proof that Buddy Candler had arrived. But beneath the orchestras, the parties, and the carefully staged spectacles, something was quietly unraveling. Excess, when sustained long enough, stops feeling like celebration and starts functioning like pressure. Briarcliff was never still. Even on days without guests, the estate consumed resources. Dozens of staff maintained the grounds, cared for animals, cleaned rooms rarely used, polished surfaces designed to impress visitors who might not arrive for weeks. The swimming pools required constant upkeep. The gardens demanded attention. The animals required feeding, cleaning, veterinary care, handlers. The organ required tuning and maintenance. The mansion itself, with its scale and custom construction, aged faster than expected. Small issues multiplied. Leaks, cracks, mechanical failures. Every solution required money, and money flowed out faster than Buddy realized. Unlike his father, Buddy did not track systems. He responded emotionally. When something broke, he replaced it with something bigger. When complaints arose, he ignored them or buried them in spectacle. When neighbors protested noise or animals, he leaned further into indulgence, convinced that visibility equaled validation. Atlanta society began to split in its opinion of him. Some still attended his parties, drawn by curiosity or status. Others distanced themselves quietly. The tone shifted. What once felt glamorous began to feel erratic. Invitations were accepted with caution. Rumors circulated, not of crime, not yet, but of instability. At the center of this world stood Helen Candler. Helen had been more than a wife. She was a stabilizing presence, the social translator who softened Buddy's impulses and presented them in acceptable form. Where Buddy was restless and obsessive, Helen was composed. She understood the rules of Atlanta society and knew how to bend them without breaking them. Her presence made Briarcliff feel intentional rather than chaotic. Her death in 1927 changed everything. Helen was only 40 years old when she died, and her passing shocked the city. Newspapers mourned her as a civic figure, not merely a socialite. Clubs, charities, and cultural organizations felt her absence immediately. For Buddy, the loss was catastrophic. Unlike the death of his infant son years earlier, which had driven him into manic productivity, Helen's death hollowed him out. The mansion did not shrink in response. It expanded. Grief did not make Buddy withdraw from Briarcliff. It bound him to it. He spent more time on the property, less time elsewhere. The estate became both refuge and prison. The parties continued, but their tone changed. Guests noticed it first in small ways. Buddy drank more openly. Conversations drifted. Schedules dissolved. The careful balance Helen had maintained vanished, and without her, the house lost its social center of gravity. 9 months after her death, Buddy remarried. The speed of the marriage unsettled Atlanta society. His new wife, Florence Stevenson, had worked as his secretary for nearly a decade. She knew the household, the staff, the rhythms of Briarcliff. To Buddy, she represented continuity, someone who understood his world. To outsiders, the marriage felt abrupt, even transactional. It reinforced the growing perception that Buddy processed emotion through action rather than reflection. Florence brought order where she could, but the house itself resisted stability. Briarcliff was no longer simply a place of display. It was becoming a container for obsessions. Buddy's long-standing fascination with magic intensified after Helen's death. What had once been a novelty became central. He collected illusions compulsively, entire rooms filled with apparatus, cabinets designed to make bodies vanish, boxes built to defy logic, stage props that required assistance, secrecy, rehearsal. The third-floor ballroom transformed into a permanent theater, not for public performance, but for private obsession. Magic appealed to Buddy for reasons deeper than entertainment. Illusion offered control. It promised mastery over reality, over disappearance, over return. At a time when his own life felt increasingly unmanageable, magic suggested that outcomes could still be manipulated if one knew the right technique. It was during this period that Buddy met Jose Cruz. Jose was young, charismatic, and talented, a magician who understood not only tricks, but presentation. To Buddy, Jose represented the embodiment of what he admired: skill paired with mystery. He invited him into his world, first as a collaborator, then as a resident. Jose moved into quarters above the garage at Briarcliff, blurring the line between staff and companion. For several years, Jose became part of the mansion's rhythm. He assisted with magic shows, helped maintain equipment, and participated in the carefully curated strangeness of Buddy's private performances. Well-known magicians visited the estate. Some stayed briefly, others returned. The mansion gained a reputation not just for wealth, but for eccentricity bordering on the surreal. But obsession, left unchecked, narrows perspective. As Buddy's focus turned inward, his awareness of the world beyond Briarcliff diminished. The late 1920 seconds were a period of national instability. Economic warning signs were visible. Speculation was rampant. Markets were fragile. But Buddy's wealth insulated him temporarily. He felt immune. He had already survived failed ventures. He believed money would always replenish itself. Then the stock market crashed in 1929. The collapse did not destroy Buddy immediately, but it altered the environment around him. Credit tightened. Investments underperformed. Maintenance costs rose while liquidity shrank. Even families with immense wealth began to feel pressure. For Buddy, whose expenditures had never aligned with income, the margin of error disappeared. At the same time, scandal arrived. In January 1931, a groundskeeper discovered a car parked on the estate where it did not belong. Inside were two bodies, Jose Cruz and a young woman named Gladys Fricks. Both were dead from gunshot wounds. The weapon belonged to Buddy. The location was his property. The press seized the story instantly. Investigations followed. A note suggested suicide. Evidence contradicted it. A coroner's jury concluded that Jose had murdered Gladys and then killed himself. Buddy was not charged with any crime. There was no evidence he had known Jose had taken the gun. But legal innocence did not erase public association. Briarcliff's image shifted overnight. What had once been a place of spectacle became a place of unease. The magic shows stopped. The parties ceased. Guests withdrew. The mansion fell quiet in a way it never had before. Silence replaced sound. The organ no longer thundered. The ballroom stood empty. For Buddy, the incident marked a psychological turning point. His drinking increased. His isolation deepened. The house, once built to prove his worth, now reminded him daily of loss, scandal, and failure. The very scale that once empowered him now overwhelmed him. As the 1930 seconds progressed, Briarcliff deteriorated in subtle but relentless ways. Staff numbers declined. Maintenance lagged. Portions of the estate fell into neglect. The zoo was gone, dismantled after legal pressure and neighbor complaints. The animals were donated to public institutions, leaving behind empty enclosures and memories that felt surreal in retrospect. Buddy's focus shifted again, this time toward death. He became deeply involved in Westview Cemetery, helping design mausoleums, pathways, monuments. What began as civic involvement became fixation. He planned his own mausoleum obsessively, refining details for years. While Briarcliff decayed, his future resting place grew increasingly elaborate. This was not irony lost on those who observed him closely. The man who had filled his life with movement and novelty now invested his energy in permanence and finality. The mansion that had been built to display life became secondary to a structure designed to house death. By the late 1930 seconds, Buddy made an unexpected decision. He stopped drinking. The reasons remain unclear. Health concerns, exhaustion, or personal resolve may have played a role. What is known is that he remained sober for the rest of his life. But sobriety did not reverse financial reality. It did not restore Briarcliff's former status. It did not repair relationships or erase memory. The estate had become unsustainable. The cost of maintaining 42 acres and a massive mansion exceeded what Buddy could afford without sacrificing everything else. The house consumed money without producing anything in return. It had never been designed to function economically. It existed only as expression. By the early 1940 seconds, war reshaped national priorities. Resources were redirected. Labor changed. Luxury became increasingly difficult to justify. Buddy, aging and increasingly isolated, watched as the world moved on without him. In 1948, the decision was made. Briarcliff was sold to the federal government. The price was far below its original cost. The man who had once hosted the most extravagant gatherings in Atlanta surrendered his palace to bureaucracy. The plan was to convert the estate into a veterans' hospital. It was a functional reuse, almost symbolic in its reversal. A house built for indulgence would serve those who had sacrificed. Buddy moved out. He relocated to a penthouse in a hotel he himself had developed years earlier. It was comfortable. It was respectable. It was not Briarcliff. The estate that had defined his identity passed out of his hands, not in scandal or spectacle, but in quiet inevitability. What Buddy did not live to fully see was that the mansion's story was far from over. Its transformation had only begun. The walls that had absorbed excess were about to absorb suffering. The rooms that had hosted illusion were about to witness treatment, confinement, and psychological strain. The things Buddy hid inside his mansion were never locked away intentionally. They were revealed gradually, through time, through neglect, through repurposing. And as Briarcliff shifted from private fantasy to public institution, the echoes of everything that had happened there did not disappear. They multiplied. What followed would give the mansion a new identity, one darker, more enduring, and far more unsettling than anything Buddy had ever imagined when he built his 40 acres of fairyland. After the sale in 1948, Briarcliff entered a phase of existence that Asa Candler Jr. never anticipated and would never witness. The transfer of the estate to federal control stripped it of personality almost overnight. Where the mansion had once reflected the restless imagination of a single man, it now belonged to systems, committees, and institutional logic. Its purpose was no longer to impress, entertain, or dazzle. It was meant to serve. Plans to convert the estate into a veterans' hospital were drawn quickly, driven by the immense need created by World War II. Thousands of soldiers were returning home carrying injuries that were not always visible. Physical wounds, psychological trauma, addiction, and dislocation demanded treatment spaces, and large properties like Briarcliff seemed ideal on paper. The mansion's size, its seclusion, and its existing infrastructure made it attractive to planners who saw function rather than history. But transformation proved more complicated than anticipated. The sheer cost of adapting a privately built luxury mansion into a modern hospital stalled progress. Budgets tightened, priorities shifted. While paperwork moved slowly through government channels, Briarcliff sat empty. The absence of human presence accelerated decay. Roof leaks went unaddressed. Humidity crept into walls. Wood warped, marble stained. The mansion that had required constant attention to maintain its illusion of perfection now received almost none. Meanwhile, Asa Candler Jr. faded quietly from public life. Living in a penthouse removed from the estate that had defined him, Buddy focused on Westview Cemetery. He poured his remaining energy into designing and refining mausoleums, including his own. It was a continuation of a long pattern. When one obsession collapsed, another replaced it. But this final fixation carried a different tone. It was no longer about spectacle, it was about permanence. When Buddy died in 1953, the newspapers treated the event with restraint. There were no sweeping retrospectives, no extended meditations on Briarcliff, no attempts to untangle the contradictions of his life. He was remembered as an eccentric heir, a man of excess, a footnote to his father's legacy. The mansion barely appeared in the obituaries. It stood empty, already beginning to outlive him. That same year, Briarcliff found a new purpose. The estate reopened as the Georgian Clinic, the first alcohol rehabilitation facility in the state of Georgia. The irony was unmistakable. The mansion, built by a man who had struggled with alcohol for much of his adult life, was now dedicated to treating addiction. The grand rooms, once filled with champagne and orchestras, were repurposed into treatment spaces. Bedrooms became patient rooms. Dining halls became communal spaces for recovery. The pools remained open, used therapeutically rather than socially. This transformation marked a fundamental shift in the mansion's emotional identity. The Georgian Clinic introduced a new kind of human energy into the building. Where guests had once arrived voluntarily, patients now came seeking relief, or were sent by families desperate for change. The laughter and music were replaced by quiet routines, counseling sessions, and moments of confrontation with personal failure. The mansion absorbed these experiences just as it had absorbed spectacle. Its walls became witnesses again, but to a very different form of vulnerability. For several years, the clinic operated successfully, but funding was always precarious. Public health resources fluctuated. By the late 1950s, budget constraints forced reductions. The swimming pools were drained and covered. Maintenance declined again. The mansion, still enormous and expensive to operate, remained underutilized. Then came the most radical transformation in its history. In 1965, the state of Georgia selected the Briarcliff property as the site for the Georgia Mental Health Institute. This decision altered not just the function of the estate, but its physical and symbolic presence. Unlike previous adaptations, this was not a subtle reuse. It was an assertion of institutional dominance over private fantasy. A massive modernist tower rose on the grounds, stark and utilitarian. It bore no architectural relationship to the Georgian Revival mansion. Its clean lines and concrete surfaces represented an entirely different philosophy: efficiency, containment, control. Surrounding it were smaller cottages arranged in a semicircle, designed to house patients in varying stages of treatment. Connecting these structures was a feature that would later fuel decades of speculation. Underground tunnels. The tunnels were practical. They allowed staff to move patients between buildings discreetly and safely, protected from weather and public view. But practicality does not prevent imagination. Bare concrete corridors, low ceilings, harsh lighting, and echoes created an atmosphere that felt oppressive even to those accustomed to institutional environments. Over time, the tunnels became central to the property's mythology. For more than 3 decades, the Georgia Mental Health Institute operated on the grounds of Briarcliff. Thousands of patients passed through its doors. Some arrived voluntarily, seeking treatment for depression, anxiety, addiction, or trauma. Others were committed against their will, placed under care according to the standards and laws of the time. Treatment methods reflected contemporary understanding, which ranged from compassionate to deeply flawed. Electroconvulsive therapy was administered, medications were tested, group therapy sessions were held in rooms that still bore traces of luxury beneath layers of institutional paint. Drop ceilings hid ornate plaster. Linoleum covered hardwood floors. Walls were erected to subdivide grand spaces into functional units. The mansion did not resist this transformation. It absorbed it. Dove's Hall, once the site of thunderous organ concerts, became an administrative and therapeutic space. The organ itself was removed, leaving behind only its console. The third-floor ballroom, once filled with illusion equipment and magic performances, was converted into dormitories for nurses. The secret doors that had once supported disappearing acts were sealed or forgotten. Layer by layer, Briarcliff's original identity was buried. But buildings remember. Staff members who worked night shifts reported strange experiences. Sounds echoed in empty corridors. Footsteps seemed to follow them through tunnels. Doors opened without explanation. Lights flickered. Whether these events were the product of exhaustion, stress, or something else entirely was never proven. But stories circulated, shared quietly among employees, reinforcing the sense that the property carried a weight beyond its physical structure. Patients, too, sensed the atmosphere. Many were unaware of the mansion's history, yet described feelings of unease, of being watched, of emotional heaviness that seemed disconnected from their immediate circumstances. In an environment already charged with psychological vulnerability, the setting amplified fear and imagination. By the time the hospital closed in 1997, Briarcliff had accumulated decades of human suffering, recovery, breakdown, and resilience. The institution left behind empty buildings filled with memories but no caretakers. The tunnels were sealed, the grounds were fenced, the mansion stood once again in silence. Silence, however, never lasts. Rumors began almost immediately. Locals whispered about lights appearing in windows at night. Trespassers claimed to hear voices. Urban explorers broke in, documenting decay and graffiti. One phrase scrawled on a fountain, "It ran with blood," became infamous, whether as dark humor or something more sinister. The abandoned property took on a new identity: haunted. In 1998, Emory University acquired the estate from the government. The purchase was historically ironic. Asa Candler Sr. had been one of Emory's greatest benefactors, donating land and money that helped establish the university's presence in Atlanta. Now, decades later, his grandson's mansion returned to institutional stewardship connected to the family legacy. But Emory faced an impossible decision. Restoration would cost millions. The mansion's roof leaked, mold spread, structural damage worsened, yet demolition was politically and culturally untenable. Briarcliff had been listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It carried architectural, social, and historical significance that could not be erased without backlash. So the university chose stasis. They secured the property, limited access, and waited. This period of benevolent neglect allowed the mansion to survive without truly living. It decayed slowly, held upright by inertia rather than purpose. Then popular culture intervened. In 2016, a television production chose the former Mental Health Institute Tower as a filming location. The series, Stranger Things, transformed the modernist hospital into the exterior of a fictional government laboratory. International attention followed. Fans traveled to see the building they recognized from the screen. Most never noticed the mansion. Hidden behind trees, weathered and quiet, Briarcliff remained unseen by the crowds drawn to the tower. The irony was striking. A fictional story brought attention to the wrong structure, while the real story, the elephants, the murder, the magic, the decades of institutionalization remained largely ignored. Preservation advocates grew increasingly alarmed. Local residents, historians, and writers began pushing for action. Among them was a researcher who uncovered long-buried details of Buddy Candler's life, piecing together archives, newspapers, and forgotten records. The murder of Jose Cruz and Gladys Fricks resurfaced. The zoo foundations were mapped, the mansion's layered identities were documented. Briarcliff was no longer just an abandoned building. It was a palimpsest of American history, industrial wealth, personal obsession, mental health policy, cultural neglect. In 2022, after decades of uncertainty, a plan finally emerged. Emory University entered a long-term ground lease with a developer specializing in senior living communities. The agreement was straightforward in concept and radical in execution. New residential buildings would be constructed on the property, and in exchange, the developer would fully restore the historic mansion. For the first time in nearly a century, Briarcliff would be repaired rather than repurposed. Craftsmen returned to the site, not to subdivide or institutionalize, but to restore. Roofs were stabilized, water damage addressed, wood paneling repaired, marble cleaned, ceilings revealed. The work was painstaking and expensive, undoing decades of neglect and alteration. The mansion was not being returned to Buddy's world. It was becoming something new, an event space, a preserved landmark, a structure allowed to exist without having to justify itself through utility or spectacle. Yet restoration raised difficult questions. What does it mean to preserve a place so deeply entangled with excess, suffering, and scandal? Can beauty be separated from the harm that occurred within its walls? Does restoration erase pain, or does it risk sanitizing it? Briarcliff does not offer easy answers. The mansion endures because it adapted. It survived not by remaining what it was, but by becoming what it needed to be at each stage. A palace, a clinic, a hospital, a ruin, a film location, a restoration project. As it enters its next phase, Briarcliff stands as a physical record of ambition unchecked and systems imposed. It reveals how wealth shapes space, how space shapes behavior, and how buildings accumulate meaning far beyond their original intent. What the Coca-Cola Heir hid inside his mansion was never a single secret. It was a pattern of escape, of excess, of transformation. And once built, the mansion refused to forget any of it. The walls remain, the stories remain. And even as restoration gives the structure new life, the echoes of everything that happened there continue to define it. Briarcliff endures not because it was perfect, but because it was honest about what happens when fortune meets instability, when dreams are built without limits, and when the spaces meant to glorify us end up preserving every part of who we were. By the time restoration plans were announced, Briarcliff had already lived more lives than most buildings ever would. Each phase left residue, not just physical damage, but psychological weight. What made the mansion different from other Gilded Age estates was not simply its scale or extravagance, but the way its purpose kept changing without ever fully erasing what came before. Every attempt to repurpose the space layered new meaning on top of old trauma, new intention on top of unresolved history. Restoration forced a reckoning. When craftsmen returned to Briarcliff in the early 2020 seconds, they encountered a structure that told its story unwillingly. Walls revealed scars, where institutional partitions had been removed. Floorboards bore marks from decades of heavy equipment and foot traffic. Ornate details emerged only after layers of paint and plaster were stripped away. Nothing about the process was simple. Every decision raised questions. What should be preserved? What should be erased? What version of Briarcliff deserved to survive? The temptation in historic restoration is nostalgia, to recreate a fantasy version of the past, stripped of its contradictions. But Briarcliff resisted that impulse. Too much had happened there. Too many lives had passed through its rooms. To restore it fully to its 1,920 seconds appearance without acknowledging what followed would be dishonest. This tension sits at the heart of Briarcliff's legacy. Asa Candler Jr. built the mansion to assert identity. He wanted permanence, recognition, proof that he mattered outside his father's shadow. In that sense, the house succeeded beyond his imagination. It outlived him. It absorbed his failures. It preserved his contradictions. It refused to disappear even when abandoned, neglected, or overwritten by institutions that had no interest in his dreams. What Buddy hid inside his mansion was not a single dark secret, but unresolved selfhood. The animals, the organ, the magic, the parties, none of these were inherently sinister. They were expressions of longing. Longing for control, admiration, escape, wonder. But because they were not grounded in stability, they became unsustainable. The mansion magnified that instability. Its scale amplified emotional extremes. Joy became spectacle. Grief became isolation. Loss echoed louder within walls designed to impress. When Helen died, the house did not adapt. It froze emotionally while continuing to demand attention. When scandal struck, the house did not protect Buddy. It framed him. When money thinned, the house did not shrink. It consumed what remained. Then institutions arrived. The Georgian Clinic marked the first time Briarcliff was used to contain rather than express. Addiction treatment repurposed rooms designed for indulgence into spaces for recovery. That transition alone would have been enough to redefine the estate. But it did not stop there. The Georgia Mental Health Institute went further, embedding Briarcliff within a system designed around surveillance, treatment, and control. This was not accidental symbolism. Large estates have often been repurposed as institutions because they already carry authority. Their size implies dominance. Their separation implies containment. Briarcliff's geography made it suitable for hiding uncomfortable realities from public view. The tunnels beneath the grounds exemplified this logic. They were efficient, discreet, invisible. They allowed patients to be moved without being seen. They ensured that suffering occurred out of sight. Over time, those tunnels became the most potent symbols of what the mansion had become, a place where human vulnerability was managed quietly, away from scrutiny. Stories emerged because silence invites imagination. Night staff talked, patients whispered, locals speculated. The abandoned years amplified this mythology. Empty buildings act as amplifiers. Every sound echoes, every shadow stretches, every rumor grows. Briarcliff did not need ghosts to feel haunted. It was haunted by accumulation of pain, of neglect, of unresolved memory. Urban explorers who broke in during the late 1990 seconds and early 2000s often described the same sensation. Not fear exactly, but heaviness. A sense that the building had seen too much, that it carried residue. Graffiti scrawled on walls attempted to give voice to that feeling. Some messages were crude, others unsettling. All were attempts to leave a mark on a place that already felt marked. When Emory University acquired the property, it inherited this weight, whether it wanted to or not. Universities are repositories of memory. Archives, libraries, preserve traditions. Emory's connection to the Candler family made the acquisition symbolically unavoidable. The institution faced a paradox. The mansion was part of its benefactor's legacy, but also part of a story that did not reflect orderly philanthropy or academic progress. It reflected messiness. Mental health policy, addiction, scandal, decline. Benevolent neglect was, for a time, the safest option. Letting the building stand without assigning meaning allowed controversy to remain dormant. But time does not preserve without consequence. Decay accelerates. Structural damage compounds. Eventually, neglect becomes a decision as consequential as demolition. The involvement of popular culture complicated matters further. When the nearby hospital tower became recognizable through television, the public narrative shifted again. Briarcliff was recontextualized as a backdrop for fiction. Fans came looking for monsters, conspiracies, and supernatural drama. Few realized that the real history on the property was already stranger, more tragic, and more human than anything scripted. The mansion remained unseen, but not untouched. Every wave of attention brought pressure. Preservation advocates grew louder, documentation improved, oral history surfaced. The story of Jose Cruz and Gladys Fricks returned to public awareness. The zoo, once dismissed as eccentric trivia, was reevaluated as an ethical failure of excess. Buddy's drinking, once sensationalized, was reframed within a broader understanding of addiction and mental health. In this way, Briarcliff's story matured. It stopped being a curiosity and became a case study. A case study in how inherited wealth affects identity, in how architecture reflects psychology, in how private indulgence becomes public consequence, in how institutions inherit the burdens of individuals long gone. Restoration forced these questions into the open. Developers and historians had to decide whether to restore the mansion to a single era or allow traces of multiple lives to remain visible. The solution leaned toward honesty. Original architectural details were preserved where possible, but the building was not turned into a shrine. Its future use as an event space acknowledged its past without attempting to relive it. This choice matters. Briarcliff does not need to pretend it was only a fairy tale castle. It was also a clinic, a hospital, a ruin, a symbol of shifting American values around wealth, health, and responsibility. Its endurance lies in that complexity. As for Asa Candler Jr., history has softened toward him. He is no longer viewed solely as an eccentric failure or a reckless heir. He is increasingly understood as a man shaped by pressures few acknowledged at the time. A son raised under rigid discipline who reacted not with rebellion but with overcompensation. A visionary without structure. A builder without restraint. A man whose imagination outran his capacity for stability. He hid nothing deliberately. He simply did not know how to stop building outward when the real work needed to happen inward. The mansion became his language. Every elephant, every pipe, every illusion was a sentence in a conversation he could not articulate otherwise. When that language failed, when the audience left, when money thinned and grief accumulated, the house remained as a physical transcript of everything he had tried to say. Today, as restoration progresses, Briarcliff stands at another threshold. It will host gatherings again. Music will return, though not from a cathedral-sized organ. People will walk its halls without knowing every detail of what occurred there. And that is inevitable. Buildings cannot force memory on those who enter them, but they can offer it. Briarcliff offers a lesson embedded in stone and wood, that wealth magnifies character rather than correcting it. That legacy is shaped as much by what we fail to address as by what we build. That places outlive intentions, and in doing so, reveal truths their creators never intended to share. What the Coca-Cola Heir hid inside his mansion was not darkness for darkness's sake. It was humanity, unfiltered and unmanaged. Ambition without boundaries, grief without language, obsession mistaken for purpose. The mansion endured because it adapted, because it absorbed meaning rather than rejecting it, because it became something larger than the man who built it. And that is why Briarcliff still matters. Not as a haunted house, not as a curiosity, but as a reminder that history does not disappear when we stop looking at it. It waits, in walls, in floor plans. In stories passed quietly from one generation to the next, Briarcliff waited a long time. Now restored, it stands ready to be seen again. Not as a fairy tale, not as a scandal, but as a place that tells the truth about what happens when fortune, freedom, and fragility collide inside the same set of walls.